Hi everyone. Sorry I couldn't be with you in New York today. I would have really loved to take part in the event, but unfortunately I had to be in Copenhagen, which is why I'm sending a videotape message. I'm going to be talking more generally about the uprisings in the Middle East and North Africa region, but more specifically on Bahrain and what's going on in Bahrain. Um, of course, as we all know, and I know that one of the things that a lot of us has been facing recently is disappointment and losing hope in the movements that started out in 2011, or rather 2010 in Tunisia. Um, but my view on the issue is that all uprisings, revolutions, or whatever you want to call them, take a lot of time, and they only succeed if we continue to trudge through the most difficult times. And it appears that we are more or less at one of those most difficult times right now, where in Syria we're seeing a massive humanitarian disaster, where people are basically stuck between a regime that's committing mass human rights atrocities, as well as extremist factions that are armed that are also attacking civilians. And of course, in Egypt, we have the military coming in power, and everyone knows the violations of the military in Egypt. And I know that you'll have speakers more specifically on these countries who can give a lot more information than I can. And Bahrain, I wouldn't call it a stalemate as many others would like to call it, but we are also in a very difficult situation because of where Bahrain is located geopolitically, and because of the Bahraini regime's connections to the West. Basically, what I'm trying to get at is that at this point it's easy to give up hope. And it's easy to say, well, you know what, we failed, we have to admit it, we have to move on. I don't think that that's the case. I think that revolutions take a very, very long time. And the only reason they will succeed is if we decide to not give up, is if we decide that despite all of the bad things that are happening, despite everything we're going through, we're going to continue going through it, we're going to continue with the same demands and so on. Now, one of the important things of continuing the struggle is reminding ourselves of why we started out doing this to begin with. Why did we take to the streets in 2011, 2010, and decided to demand these things at times when we knew what kind of regimes we had in our countries? I mean, it wasn't a surprise to people in Syria that, Bashar al-Assad started using force against peaceful protesters. The same thing in Bahrain, the same thing in Egypt, the same thing in Yemen, Tunisia, and all these other countries. So why is it that we decided to take to the streets? And I think, from my study of these many different countries, is that we saw more or less the same reasons for people to take to the streets. It wasn't that, in my opinion, it wasn't that these revolutions caused each other, but rather that these revolutions inspired each other. All of these different countries that participated in what is known as the Arab Spring, albeit I don't like that terminology. But the reason why all of these countries took part is if you look at the causes that make people feel like they have reached a point where the only way to move forward, to demand their dignity and so on, is to take to the streets. Many of these causes are very similar. Whether we're talking about arbitrary arrests, systematic torture, massive corruption, governments or families that rule an entire country based on a one-man rule or a family rule. And this was the same whether we're talking about the monarchies or we're talking about the republics, of course. So corruption, torture, arrests, murder, all of these different things that were happening and occurring in all these different countries. Poverty, of course, which was the main cause or the main result of the corruption that was ongoing. And when people took to the streets in 2011, it wasn't, at least when I speak on about myself, when I took to the streets with people, and from what I know from the most people that participated in these uprisings, and continue to participate, of course, is that nobody woke up in the morning and said, well, I am, a Sunni Arab or Syrian or Egyptian or Copt or Shia or Muslim or whatever it is, a group I belong to, and said, oh, that's the reason why I'm going to go out on the street today and demand change. It was because people woke up that day and said, as an Egyptian, as a Bahraini, as a Syrian, as a human being, I am going to go out and take part in the uprising today. And it was because in many of these countries, it doesn't matter what group you belong to. These governments, these regimes, these families, these individuals who rule relentlessly as dictators, they don't really care what sect or religion you belong to. They'll use sect and religion to separate us, but they won't use it. It's not because they actually care about a certain group. It's because of the main idea of divide and conquer. Now, what happened next was that, of course, it's exactly what I just mentioned, is that many of these governments tried to use divide and rule as a way to stop the protest movements. And so in Egypt, we had Mubarak trying to push that story of Copts versus Muslims. In Syria, it was the idea of, oh, this is, a Shia versus Sunni or Alawi versus Sunni struggle. In Bahrain, the regime tried to portray it as being a Sunni versus Shia struggle, and so on. To some extent, the regimes have been successful in creating this scenario. It's a lot easier for many of us to label each other, to decide where one's support should be based on the labeling. And I find that very, very disturbing. For me, you don't necessarily have to be pro-Syrian revolution and be anti-Bahraini revolution. You can be both. And you don't necessarily have to be pro-Iran government and anti-Saudi government. You can be anti-both. And this type of labeling doesn't actually benefit anyone other than the regimes that rule us. And this is one of the ways that they continue to stay in power. It's by separating all of the activists. It's by separating the revolutionaries, telling them that their main issue and their main fight is against other people within the country rather than the government itself. This is how these governments think that they can survive these movements. And so I believe that one of the most important things that we need to remind ourselves at this point in time is not just the continuation of the struggle, it's that we're in this together, all of us. And it doesn't matter if we're Sunni or Shia or Alawite or whatever it is, what our religion is, whether we're Christian or Muslim or Jewish or whatever. And it doesn't even matter what, our political or religious beliefs are. The things that we're demanding, like social justice, like democracy, like a right for a people to have a say in their government, is something that crosses sectarian lines. It crosses religious lines. And so that's why we have to find that common ground where we can all stand together and make these demands together and work together towards it. Because a lot of these regimes are doing such a great job at working together against us. And they're doing such a great job at separating us. And so what we can do best right now is for us to stick together, is to build those bridges and work together. To give you a very quick update on Bahrain, like I mentioned already, the Bahrain situation is still ongoing. Since 2011, the protests haven't stopped. They just stopped being covered in the media. We continue to document almost on a daily basis cases of arbitrary arrest, house raids, systematic torture, unfair trials, lengthy sentences, all forms of harassment, violations, and so on. And this has been ongoing almost on a daily basis, like I said. Currently, it seems like there's a political stalemate. A lot of people like to describe it that way. I don't believe that that's the case. I think that we're reaching a point where people are so frustrated and so angry, we're probably going to have something similar to 2011 happen again. But it probably will not be as peaceful. A lot of people are unfortunately not as convinced with the idea of nonviolent struggle anymore. Their reaction usually when you tell them that nonviolence is the only way to go is, well, look where it's gotten us so far. So it's, in that sense, it is a bit depressing. But the fact that people continue to take to the streets, they continue to make these demands, is in itself hope. To wrap up here, I guess my message today is it's far beyond just Bahrain's borders. It's far beyond the situation within the prison cells or within people's homes while they're being attacked or on the streets of Bahrain. It's about taking a step back and looking at this much larger connected struggle that we're all going through. And the importance of all of us working together and sticking together and, having a united front. I pray for the day when we will see freedom everywhere in the Middle East and North Africa, and especially in Syria and Egypt and Libya and Bahrain and Yemen, all the other countries. Thank you very much.